in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to today's Trip Generation Recommendations webinar. My name is Joe Robertson, and I work with Kimley Horn in the Tallahassee office. Over the past 2 years, we've been working with Gary, Gina, and Andrew on many different trip generation-related topics of interest to FDOT, and they've asked me to come on and just put together a webinar to tell everyone what we've been looking at and what our recommendations are. So today I'm going to go over some of the things that we've focused on, as well as the department's recommendations on best practices for trip generation in Florida. And if you're familiar with using GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar, then you'll already know how to raise hands and answer questions and whatnot. And so feel free at any time, if you have some questions, you can type it into the question box or raise your hand, and we've got several panelists here who can help you out with that. I'm going to begin by providing a brief outline of today's presentation, which will include an introduction of what we've done, followed by the purpose and need for the report. Next, I'll summarize the recent FDOT trip generation, pass-by, and internal capture research, as well as a summary of emerging land uses, the review of related literature and software, and our overall research recommendations. Since trip generation is one of the first steps in assessing the traffic impacts of new development, it's important to ensure that the analysis methods are accurate. And since FDOT is responsible for the state's roadway system, the department saw the need to assess trip generation and internal capture practices within Florida, as well as to look into other research being conducted around the country. Since new research and analysis methods are constantly being published and updated, it's important for FDOT to stay up to date on the latest practices in the industry. This applies not only to trip generation and internalization practices, but also to software tools used in traffic impact studies. By staying up to date with the latest practices and collecting Florida-specific data, the accuracy of traffic studies in Florida will likely improve. Our report summarizes recent research and provides recommendations on trip generation best practices in the state of Florida. Today's webinar will highlight the information contained within the report. However, we're not going to cover everything, so if you're interested in getting more information or haven't seen the full report yet, please let us know and we'll be sure to send you a copy of the document. First off, we'll take a look at some recent FDOT trip generation studies. Many of you are probably familiar with these studies, which collected and analyzed trip generation and pass-by trip capture data for a handful of land uses. The first study was published in February of 2011 and included freestanding discount superstores, home improvement superstores, small box stores, and single retailer distribution centers. The second study, which was published in December of 2012, included convenience markets with gas pumps and suite-style student apartments. All these land uses were selected because their trip generation data was either underrepresented by ITE, or there was reason to believe that the trip generation characteristics in Florida are different from the national averages. This is an example of the summary tables that we created for this report. As you can see, these tables contain lots of useful information. However, they can be a little difficult to interpret at first. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of how they are laid out. For this example, the blue row near the top represents the FDOT study rate. The top row will always represent the base study rate that the rest of the table is being compared to. All other rows represent other studies and rates that we are comparing to the base. The vertical dashed line represents a bar graph showing the percent difference between the studies. For this example, the base is the FDOT study rate of 64.01 trips per 1,000 square feet. For the comparison studies, if the bar is red and to the left, it's below the FDOT study rate, or the base rate. If the bar is blue and to the right, that means that it's greater than whatever the base rate is we're looking at. First land use we'll look at today is the convenience market with gas pumps. Many of these newer developments not only have more fueling position than traditional fueling stations, but they also contain more services and amenities in the convenience market portion of the site. Previous research on convenience markets with gas pumps indicated that newer Florida developments may have trip generation characteristics different from those already included in ITE reports. To research the differences, FDOT studied 12 modern convenience market with gas pump sites throughout Florida in 2012. Similar to ITE's findings, the study determined that both gross floor area and the number of fueling positions were significant variables in estimating trip generation. Average trip generation rates were calculated for both gross floor area and fueling positions during the weekday, daily, and PM peak hour periods as part of this study. To give you an idea of the differences between these old and new gas station types, Gary had provided me with a few photos for me to share with the group today. This photo shows a more traditional style fueling station. As you can see, the emphasis here is placed on the fuel pumps, and the convenience store portion is fairly small. While we still see many of these gas stations around, it's becoming more common to see the modern convenience markets with gas pumps, such as what's shown here on the next slide. This photo shows one of the new Wawa stores. Wawa stores are a great example of modern convenience markets with gas pumps, as they have a large number of fueling positions, but also provide a variety of convenience goods inside, such as fast foods, prepared foods, and in some cases small grocery sections. Here's another one. This is a new racetrack store. This is a great example of this land use also. And as you can probably assume from this photo, the site will likely generate more trips than your average gas station. This table shows the results from the FDOT study, as well as research from several other studies performed over the years. The top portion of the table shows the rates per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area, and the bottom portion shows the rates per fueling position. The FDOT study rates are highlighted in blue, and the bar graphs provide a graphical representation of the differences between the rates. Comparison of the results with ITE rates shows that the Florida rates are significantly higher than ITE for both independent variables. Several other studies are included for comparison purposes, which also show that ITE has likely underestimated trip generation. What's interesting for this land use is that while both independent variables are significant when used alone, it was found that using a multivariable equation that includes both gross floor area and fueling positions results in a more accurate estimation of the trip generation. The upper table on this slide shows the multivariable equations derived for the weekday, daily, and PM peak hour periods. The multivariable equations, which include both gross floor area and fueling positions, were found to estimate trips more accurately than using either variable independently. So to give an example on how to use the equation to estimate the PM peak hour trip generation, you would multiply the number of fueling positions at the site by 12.3, then multiply the number of 1,000 square feet of the convenience market portion of the site by 15.5, and add the two together, and that'll give you your estimate for the total number of trips. ITE currently only uses single variable equations. However, due to the increasing types of uses present at these new developments, a multivariable analysis may be preferable in estimating trip generation. And just to give a better idea of the accuracy of these equations, it's worth noting that the R-squared values for both the daily and PM peak hour equations here are 0.88 or greater, which shows there's a great correlation between the model and the observed data for these sites. Pass-by data was also collected for the study and is shown at the bottom table. The study found the pass-by trip percentage to be 78% during the PM peak hour, which is pretty closely related to the pass-by rate of 76%, which ITE shows for this land use, if only the Florida sites are considered. So our recommendation for this land use is when you're analyzing new convenience markets with gas pumps in Florida, similar to those included in the study, FDOT recommends that the multivariable equations be used for estimating trip generation. Additionally, it's recommended that the 78% PM peak hour pass-by trip rate be used for this land use. Another land use included in the studies was small box stores. These stores are defined as discount retail stores that provide a variety of goods including health and beauty products, cleaning supplies, snack foods, household items, and clothing, amongst other things. Some good examples of this land use are Dollar General and Family Dollar stores. But we should also note that the research done on these small box stores does not include Dollar Tree type stores or stores where everything sells for $1 or less. In recent years, there's been an increase in the popularity of these small box stores in Florida. Since small box stores did not have their own ITE land use at the time of study, other related land uses are often used to estimate trips. For this study, 15 small box store sites were selected throughout the state for analysis. These stores ranged in size from roughly 8 to 17,000 square feet of gross floor area. As I mentioned a moment ago, typically ITE land uses such as specialty retail, shopping center, and freestanding discount superstores have been used to analyze small box stores. However, as you can see in the upper table, small box stores in Florida that were studied in the research were found to generate more trips than all other related ITE land use categories. You can see that the rates from this study are roughly 30 to 60% higher than the ITE rates during both the daily and PM peak hour periods. This suggests that small box stores are a distinct land use category that have likely been underestimated in the past. Pass-by trip data was also collected at 5 of the study sites and is shown in the bottom table. It was determined that these sites had an average of 34% pass-by trips, which is considerably higher than the 17% average for ITE's freestanding discount superstore, but is more consistent with the pass-by rate for ITE's shopping center data. Since this research was released in 2011, ITE has included FDOT's data in the ITE Journal, which is internationally published, so many of you might recall seeing this research before. Here you can see an excerpt from the journal article. More recently and more importantly, the FDOT small box store research has been added to the 9th edition of ITE's Trip Generation Manual as Land Use 814, which is a brand new category that wasn't present in previous editions. The manual added both trip generation data and the pass-by data that was collected. Here's a quick look at the trip generation data that was added to the manual. You can see the new land use category 814, and you can see that the rate and number of studies shown is consistent with the Florida research that was done. The scatter plot of the data has also been included, which shows the individual data points representing each site included within the study. So for our recommendation, FDOT recommends the use of the Florida data, which is now included in ITE as Land Use 814 in the 9th edition. As seen in the study, the rates are roughly 30 to 60% higher than the rates for the commonly used ITE rates during both the daily and PM peak hour periods, which suggests that small box stores are a distinct land use category that have been underestimated in the past. The next land use researched was large single retailer distribution centers. At the time of the study, large distribution centers of approximately 1 million square feet were not specifically addressed in the 8th edition of ITE's Trip Generation Manual. These large distribution centers are of particular importance to FDOT due to their typical proximity to freeway interchanges. So to better understand the trip characteristics of this land use, FDOT analyzed the trip characteristics of 9 sites throughout the state that ranged from 500,000 square feet to just under 1.5 million square feet. As shown in the table, the FDOT study rates were found to be higher than the related ITE land use rates and fairly close to other analysis results from Florida that were done over the past decade. It's therefore recommended that the FDOT study rates be used for large single retailer distribution centers within Florida, as they are more conservative than the ITE rates. Another land use included in the studies was freestanding discount superstores. These are typically your Walmart and Target type stores that sell a wide variety of goods, including clothing, electronics, health and beauty supplies, home goods, and in some cases groceries. Recent Florida and ITE journal studies have shown higher trip generation rates for freestanding discount superstores than those published in ITE's 9th edition as Land Use 813. To try and more accurately predict trips for this land use, FDOT collected data at 20 sites ranging in size from 125,000 square feet to 200,000 square feet throughout Florida in 2010. As shown in this table, the FDOT study results were found to be lower than ITE Land Use 813 rates and other similar studies. Since the studies were completed entering the downturn in the economy, it's likely that these rates may not be representative of actual trips generated in the future. Therefore, it's recommended to continue using ITE Land Use 813 trip generation and pass-by rates for analyzing these freestanding discount superstores. In an effort to estimate the trip generation of home improvement superstores in Florida, 10 sites around the state were chosen. Sites included Lowe's and Home Depot type stores ranging from 100,000 square feet to 138,000 square feet. The data collected most closely relates to ITE Land Use 862. The study rates were found to be similar to ITE rates, so the recommendation is to continue using ITE Land Use 862, which is Home Improvement Superstore. Additionally, it's worth noting that since the FDOT data was collected in 2010, the rates were much lower than the 2007 data collected in a FDOT District 7 study. This can also likely be attributed to the economic recession. Another land use included in these studies was suite-style student apartments. Development trends indicate that there will be continued growth in the number of student apartment developments in the coming years. There's currently little existing data available for this land use, most of which relies on rough estimates and assumptions. FDOT collected data on suite-style student apartments in 2012. However, due to variation in peak periods and student trip-making habits, it's recommended that the study rates be used with caution and that additional local research be conducted if analyzing student apartments. Another topic we looked into was trip generation for emerging land uses. Many land uses out there are not currently included or not well represented in ITE's trip generation manual. There are also some land use types that may generate trips differently in Florida than they do in other parts of the country. As a result, we have identified some land uses for potential future research in Florida. The first emerging land use is the power center. Power centers are large shopping centers which include one or more large anchor stores and other inline or outparcel retail and restaurant sites. Due to the size of these developments, they may have different trip generation characteristics than your typical shopping centers represented by ITE. To give you a better idea of what a power center is, I've included a site plan example. Those of you here in the Tallahassee area are probably familiar with the Falls Chase Shopping Center off of Mahan Drive, which would be considered a power center upon build-out. As you can see, the development has several inline anchor stores, including Walmart, Bass Pro, and Costco. There are also plans to add other smaller outparcels, including restaurants, small retail, and a movie theater. As you can probably imagine, these larger power centers generate large amounts of traffic, and we'll get into how others have analyzed them later in the presentation. Casinos are a unique land use from a trip generation perspective. Trip generation is often based on trips per gaming position, and studies show that peak hour generator is often different than the peak hour of the adjacent street. So there's some different issues here as opposed to a lot of other land uses. Several studies were reviewed as part of our report from around the country that include trips per gaming position during the peak hour. The recommendations report includes additional information on this research and rates if you're more interested. The number of retirement communities and charter schools in Florida have also been increasing over the past decade. Charter schools are not currently represented in ITE's data, so other school rates are often used instead. It's estimated that there are currently around 570 charter schools in Florida with over 200,000 students enrolled. Very little research exists related to charter schools, and the upper table shown on this slide includes average rates calculated from 3 studies in South Florida. From looking at these studies, it's apparent that charter schools generate trips differently than ITE private and elementary school land uses. The rates included were higher in the AM peak, but lower in the PM peak. And many of these differences in trips could probably be attributed to since school buses operate differently with charter schools as they do with public schools. Additionally, retirement communities in Florida are believed to generate differently than existing ITE land uses. There's actually not much Florida data included in ITE for senior housing. This table at the bottom shows average rates determined from 9 studies in Marion and St. Johns counties. You can see that the Florida retirement communities have a lower daily rate than related ITE uses, senior adult housing, detached, and attached. For both of these land uses, we think it would be beneficial to conduct additional studies to improve the accuracy of trip generation. In the coming years, it's anticipated that Florida will see an increase in the number of beach resort communities, thus making the need for accurate trip generation estimates more important. There are currently no distinct data or rates for beach resorts in ITE's manual. Sometimes hybrid rates are used, which are typically a combination of vacation home and single-family residential rates. It would be beneficial to collect data on these resorts in an effort to develop accurate trip generation estimates for traffic impact analysis in Florida. We've also been looking at some specialty land uses that aren't represented by ITE. One specialty land use that's expanding in Florida is Bass Pro Shops. Bass Pro offers outdoor-related sporting goods, but many stores also include large indoor aquariums and water features, wildlife demonstrations, workshops, and some even have restaurants. The large size of the store and additional features lead us to believe that Bass Pro Shops generate trips differently than your more traditional sporting goods stores represented by ITE's data. As there are currently 9 locations in Florida and 6 more planned to open soon, it may be beneficial to conduct trip generation research on Bass Pro Shops. Another specialty land use is IKEA. There are currently 3 locations in Florida. As IKEA stores offer furniture, appliances, and home accessories, many locations are also multi-story and include restaurants, food markets, and childcare services for shoppers. As a result, IKEA stores generate trips differently than your typical furniture store. To give you an idea of how IKEA generates more trips, it's worth noting that during the Saturday peak hour, ITE land use 890 has a rate of 0.95 trips per 1,000 square feet. ITE 869, Discount Home Furnishing Superstore, more closely relates to IKEA and has a rate of 3.29 trips per 1,000 square feet during the Saturday peak hour, but there's only a few studies included. A Portland, Oregon ITE student chapter study found an average rate of 4.47 trips per 1,000 square feet, which is higher than both of the ITE land uses I just mentioned. After looking at this comparison, it may be beneficial to collect additional trip generation data for IKEA. It might also be a good idea to create a trip generation advisory group that could identify and study these emerging land uses, which would be beneficial for Florida. Now I'll quickly run through some of the studies we included in our literature review as part of this recommendations report. The first one is the Vermont Trip Generation Manual. The Vermont Agency of Transportation, also known as VTrans, conducted a study from 2008 to 2010 to measure local trip generation rates. The study consisted of more than 1,000 individual trip generation counts for 17 different land uses. The study determined that in general, ITE data tends to overestimate trip generation in rural and small urban areas. Similarly, there's the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission Trip Generation Study. This study collected data also to develop local trip generation rates and compare to ITE rates. This report included 12 land uses and found that differences from ITE rates vary depending on land use type. So essentially, some rates were higher and some rates were lower. FDOT District 7 did research on discount and home improvement superstores, similar to what was done by the central office a few years ago, to assess local trip generation rates in Florida and compare them to ITE rates. The District 7 study found that trip generation rates for discount and home improvement superstores are greater in Florida than what's shown in ITE's national averages. And going back to the Power Center that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the North Carolina section of ITE collected trip generation data at 10 power centers to determine the most appropriate method to predict trips. Several scenarios were developed to estimate trip generation, and it was found that the most accurate method for daily and PM peak hour was determined just to simply use ITE land use 820, which is shopping center rates. A few more. The Caltrans Urban Infill Development Study. They did this study because ITE data typically reflects isolated suburban development which lacks transit service and pedestrian and bicycle facilities. Caltrans conducted a research study at 27 sites to address the need for more accurate trip generation data for urban infill developments. The results found that observed trip generation rates for infill development are generally lower than ITE rates, and they actually included some rates that you can use if you're working within an infill area. Similarly is NCHRP 758, which also looked at trip generation for infill developments. The objective of this study was to develop a method to estimate automobile trip generation and mode shares of non-vehicular trips for infill development. The report developed formulas to convert ITE trip generation from vehicular trips to person trips, and then from person trips to infill vehicle trips. There's also the FDOT community capture methodology, which was developed by FDOT for large self-standing developments such as new communities or towns where site internal capture methods may not be applicable. Community capture extends the application of internal capture to include potential trip interactions and reductions within the boundaries of large-scale multi-use developments. It should be noted that this community capture methodology should only be used in analyzing very large DRI level developments with a large mix of land uses and an internal roadway network. So it's not applicable to small sites. One of the larger reports we looked at was the NCHRP 684 internal capture research. As you're probably aware, for years ITE has used three internal capture land use categories: office, retail, and residential, to estimate trip internalization in mixed-use developments. NCHRP took the ITE method a step further by researching large mixed-use developments to collect additional data for three more land use categories: restaurant, cinema, and hotel. The methodology for calculating internal capture in NCHRP 684 is essentially the same as the traditional ITE method in the way that it estimates trip interaction, but some of the push-pull rates have been changed based on the new data and new categories. The addition of the three land use categories typically result in an increased accuracy for internal capture estimation. As a result, this six-category method is now included in the latest ITE Trip Generation Handbook, which came out several months ago. They may be difficult to read on this slide, but this graphic shows the updated internal capture rates in tables 7.1 and 7.2 of the handbook. This new method has replaced the traditional three land use method, and we recommend using these new rates as they will likely be more accurate in estimating site internal capture. FDOT District 2 also conducted an internal capture study several years ago to establish general percentage estimates for use within the district. Based on their findings from 4 mixed-use developments, the study indicates that future mixed-use developments in District 2 should expect an average daily internal capture rate of approximately 32%. Surveys collected for the peak hours show average internal capture rates of 20% in the AM peak and 30% in the PM peak. More recently, Qatar conducted site internal capture research on several mixed-use developments throughout Florida. Qatar selected 4 sites based on strict criteria from which they conducted detailed surveys to collect trip internalization information. The data was collected based on the same 6 land use categories used in NCHRP 684 and could therefore be easily compared to current internal capture methods. Based on the data, the research team reached the preliminary conclusion that for traditional multi-use developments, the average internal capture rate is estimated to be 15% or less. For highly integrated developments, the average internal capture rate could be as high as 40%. The research determined that the most appropriate approach for estimating site internal capture would be to use the maximum unconstrained internal capture rates from ITE, NCHRP 684, and the Qatar research. This graphic shows a comparison of internal capture estimates for the sites studied in NCHRP 684 and Qatar research. The dashed line horizontally represents the observed trip data, while the bars represent estimated trips using each study method. Looking at the graph, it's apparent that the ITE single land use method, shown in blue, and the ITE 3 land use method, shown in green, both significantly overestimate internal capture for every site. The Qatar FDOT method, shown in orange, appears to consistently be more accurate than the other methods. Results obtained through this research verified that this enhanced methodology produced more accurate estimates than the traditional internal capture procedures found in the ITE Trip Generation Handbook. A summary of the revised unconstrained internal capture rates from this study are included in our recommendations report, and the full internal capture research report is available as well on the FDOT's website. We also looked at some popular software tools as part of this research. OTIS, which stands for Online Traffic Impact Study Software, is a cloud-based trip generation tool developed by Transoft that includes all of the information from the 9th edition of the Trip Generation Manual. We have tested OTIS for user-friendliness and capabilities using various sample problems, and we've even used it on a few small projects. Overall, it's a useful tool for basic studies and quick estimations. However, we found for more complicated projects, such as large mixed-use development, we found Otis to be a little less useful. Here's a screenshot of Otis in action. Otis automatically calculates trip generation and pass-by, but internal capture calculations are only partially automated. You can kind of see at the bottom you have to input all of your push and pull percentages by hand. Since the software was released, we've worked with the Otis developers and provided feedback to improve the software. However, we have not used the most recent versions, so we're not sure if they integrated our input or not. In addition to the NCHRP 684 report, as I mentioned earlier, a spreadsheet was also created to quickly estimate site internal capture using the 6 land use method. This spreadsheet is available for free online and requires minimal inputs, but the raw trip generation must be calculated by other means before using this tool. As for our recommendations, we feel that it would be beneficial to conduct trip generation research on the emerging land uses mentioned earlier, as many of them are underrepresented or non-existent in ITE's data. This list shows the land uses we are recommending for study, and additional information on these is included in the recommendations report. In the Caltrans Urban Infill Study, these rates may be used for more similar developments in Florida until more research becomes available. We also recommend that the District 2 trip internalization study percentages be used for generally estimating overall site internal capture if more detailed information is unavailable. As the NCHRP 684 methodology is now included in the latest ITE trip generation handbook and seems to be more accurate than the traditional ITE 3-category method, we recommend its use for estimating site internal capture. And since the Cutter FDOT internal capture research seemed to have enhanced the NCHRP methodology even further, it may be considered as an option for analysis if appropriate for your site and agreed to with the reviewing agency. As for software recommendations, FDOT is currently developing an online trip generation tool that will be recommended for use once it's completed. The new tool includes the most common ITE trip generation and pass-by data, as well as the NCHRP 684 internal capture methodology. This slide gives a brief overview of the trip generation tool that Kimley Horn is currently developing for FDOT. The tool will be used to simplify the TIA process by automatically calculating trip generation, internal capture, and pass-by. The tool is online-based and runs in any web browser and only requires a few inputs to generate a summary table of results. The tool is accurate and very easy to use, and it's currently undergoing final development and testing. We've been working very closely with Gary, Gina, and Andrew, as well as FDOT's Office of Information Systems, and we're getting very excited that this tool is getting closer to completion. In conclusion, we've covered what we've been working on related to trip generation research with FDOT. At this stage, everything is coming together, and we should be finalizing our research and findings within the next few months. I'd also like to mention that once the online trip generation tool is completed, we're anticipating hosting how-to webinars to introduce the tool and provide instruction on its use. Here's my contact information if you have any questions after today's presentation. I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar and thank FDOT for having me present today. And now we'll open it up to any questions you may have about today's presentation or the recommendations report in general.
Gary, are there any questions in the question box that you're seeing? I'm seeing one from Debbie Danton that might be better answered via voice than typing.
Oh, okay, good. Debbie, what Debbie said was, why are the higher rates nearly always recommended? If Florida study shows a higher rate than ITE, it goes on to say that she conducted a Perdido key rate with an ITE with a lower rate than ITE, and overestimating trips is not always good. Yes, true, and may not be accurate, costing more money. I mean, for everybody, not just the developers. I'm adding that myself. My answer that I was preparing was that I hope we haven't done that consistently throughout these recommendations, and they are recommendations. Getting a little off topic here is our latest Site Impact Handbook, which is less prescriptive than the one that was produced in 1979, and also less prescriptive than the one that was produced in 2010. We make recommendations, but that doesn't mean that in the case, and I'm not familiar with Perdido Key, that if you measured something that was very similar to the development that you were doing the study for and had reasons to believe that the existing Perdido rates were better than what was national, you definitely have the ability to argue your case. And as I said, I hope we did not do that in this study. Maybe as you read the entire report, you'll find that we didn't do that. We went over numbers pretty quickly here, but some of the pass-by numbers that we found were higher than the national figures. And so in short, I sure hope we didn't recommend just always what was the highest. And if there is a reason to believe in any point that the numbers that we are recommending are not correct and not the best for the study, we are open, and even more open now to listen to some of these arguments. Okay,
we're getting a lot of questions coming in.
Yeah,
let's
sure
see if we
do.
can try our best to answer these one by one.
Yeah, I guess there's a few easy ones that have come in. Some questions about, will these Caltrans reports be made available? We can send that out afterwards. And then another one, where was it? There was a question, if did you consider looking into the 10% limit of adjacent street traffic for pass-by? If you're asking about in the trip generation tool, that is something that we've looked into, and we actually have added functionality into the tool that limits the pass-by to 10% of the adjacent street traffic, assuming that you put the adjacent street traffic volumes into the tool.
And also considering that sometimes when you're building a development, there may not be much traffic on it right there, and then sometimes the 10% might not be the best stopping point. But that has to be something that's discussed between the reviewers and the people working for the developer. And the 10%, as far as an analysis, did this come out of some sort of multi-million-dollar study or even $100,000 study? I believe it was based more along the lines of common sense. But that is, a starting point.
Richard Rank is asking if there is a hyperlink for the trip internalization spreadsheet, NCHRP 684.
Yes,
Yes.
It's in the NCHRP blurb page, which gives you a place to download the report and the spreadsheet. And I want to put a plug in here for spreadsheets that don't do everything. Some people may look at it as a disadvantage that you can't just plug in how many square feet of commercial, how many housing units, and it doesn't automatically fill things in. I'm actually a believer in it might actually be superior to have to do your trip generation in one report and then take those numbers and put it into the trip internalization calculations rather than one gigantic black box. But that's my personal opinion.
Looks like Michelle Arnold responded to our response to her original question. She said her question was, if the 10% limit was updated in the trip generation research, why not 15% or 20% of adjacent street traffic?
Only because the 10% has been used traditionally, and because we have not done the research, at least sufficient research on this. Again, you can see that there would be cases where the 10% might be too restrictive. For instance, as I said, in the early phases of a large development that's going onto a road that has very little traffic to begin with. We're getting some good questions in here.
Oh, we're getting a lot of them.
And the ones that we cannot answer, sufficiently here, we will get with the people who asked them, and if possible, add them to our communications, our after webinar communications with you, where we will have the links to the articles, the reports, and the spreadsheets that we've talked about. And there's a question here, and for the student. Okay, if DOT has developed a recommended trip rate for gas station convenience markets, will they be included in the KHA tool? And I would have to say, this is Gary, and I'm not developing it myself. KHA is working more closely with other people. They probably would. Now, on the other hand, I don't know if Joseph mentioned this. ITE has always been against anything more than the use of one independent variable, and we're going kind of against the grain there for ITE, but we really think it does a much better job in this new world of convenience markets.
Right, and I think that it's something that could definitely be included. I guess we haven't discussed it too much yet, but we can sit down with Gary and decide if that's something that that the people want included. We got to give the people what they want. So.
Mm-hmm. I see a question here. This is Gary. Is there any research on the emergency clinics? Has only 2 studies. That is an excellent suggestion for our next go-round. I don't believe we mentioned it before. I started working at DOT in 1985, and we did a lot of studies back in the 1970s and then stopped completely doing them up until very recently with the studies that were done for us by CDM Smith. And there is so much interest in this that definitely are interested in suggestions. The internet economy has completely changed so many business models that, you know, for instance, the big one and the oldest one are banks. Banks, you know, they had to just throw all the data out from banks that they did before drive-ins. Then, once they had ATMs, then they had to throw all the data out for the ones with drive-ins. It's completely rearranging how business is done. And the emergency clinics are one thing, and now there are emergency clinics being put into CVS and Walgreens stores. So it's ever changing.
And Gary, I see another question here from Kim Graham. Is asking, do you use the rates or equations in the software, and how do you determine which one to use when? And actually, for all the land uses we've got included, if equations are available, then we have rates and equations. But as you probably know, some land uses only have the rates. So most of them are in there if they're available from ITE. However, for determining which one to use when, you'll have to use a little bit of professional judgment and maybe consult the actual ITE data to determine, because it does vary based on the land use and the particular intensity of that land use, the size of it.
The ITE trip generation handbook has a mathematical determination on which is best, and some models that are out there will do that for you, and they'll say, well, from everything we've looked at, we really should use the formula, the equation, or from everything we've seen, we really should be using the rate. Historically at DOT, we've asked people to be a little bit more thoughtful. Not that they're saying that there's a whole bunch wrong with the ITE numerically based method for choosing, but without boring people anymore, I mean, it also makes a difference how far the separation between pods of development within one shopping center is on whether, you know, you use, we've even in some of our training suggested that you might do an analysis based on some sort of average between the equation and the rate. If for instance, it's really hard to get from one side of the shopping center to the other.
And Gary, there's a question on here that you may like to answer. Do you think local jurisdictions in Florida will accept the FDOT trip gen rates?
You know, that's not. That's a loaded question, which I really can't answer. Here's why. when it comes to the standpoint of a simple calculation that's used in, let's say, a well-established concurrency model, they may balk at making these changes, or they may look at them and say, for our purposes, no, we're not going to change it. You know, this is not an accurate, this is not, you know, it is not an exact science, and there are a lot of judgment questions that go into it, and also when it comes down to how much money is owed, there are sometimes actual negotiations that go on in this. It is not I don't believe was our intent when we started these studies that these would be imposed as you have to do this. You have to go in and change your concurrency management system. We do have 8 district agencies that deal with a variety of local governments, and the local governments have their own standards and have their own traffic study standards. So our plan is to get this out there, to have these discussions, and we think we are very proud of the work that's been done in the last 5 years or so, because we really did not have any axe to grind in these studies. Okay, we really did this based on wanting to know more about these land uses. Sometimes you will have somebody working for a company that handles all the HEB stores in Texas do a study, and they'll study 20 HEB stores. I believe our data is good, and it's a good fair starting point. But we're definitely not telling people that this is the latest, the greatest. You have to do it. There's a question here about trip generation for transit-related uses or bike and ped-related uses, and it was really only touched on here. But John, if you don't know this, and you can email us also. What you're talking about are trip generations for very different than suburban areas. This is the latest, I guess, frontier of trip generation. The California DOT, or Caltrans, has just started up a new study to go forward on some of the work they did, and some of the work they did is relatively old. I'm saying about 5 years old, where they did bicycle trip generation for various apartment buildings around the transit stations in San Francisco. They did door counts of pedestrians. This is the way we're headed. Even the latest, or the one that they're working on, ITE, the ITE, the next edition of the ITE Trip Generation Handbook is going to be based on person trips and not vehicle trips. It's going to make things a lot more difficult for some of us that are, were brought up in the old way. If you are interested and have the patience, and you go to the trip internalization spreadsheet that was put together for the NCHRP report, which is free, you will see that is also person trip based and not vehicle trip based.
Gary?
Yeah.
Can I tag on to that answer a little bit?
Sure.
In these studies, at least the first studies that we did on the little box and home improvement superstores and the discount superstores, we did collect ped, bike, and transit counts at all the sites that had transit or that had a clear ped bike connection. In most cases, it wasn't significant. One of the sites in Tallahassee, one of the little box sites, had very significant foot traffic and had very different numbers for automobile trips as a result. So it is possible to dig into the data a little more there. Part of the reasoning here was to start collecting this data, giving it to ITE, because ITE is collecting this type of data from everyone who is willing to supply it.
Yeah, and Martin, I absolutely forgot about that. The store that Martin is talking about is a perfect example of high percentage of pedestrians. And a very tiny, if I remember, because I have shopped there before, an extremely tiny parking lot. Does anybody, I mean, there are a lot of questions here. I'm just trying to go through and see. I'm lazy. I'm trying to see which ones we can answer easily if possible. Those that we can't, we will look into and send you if we have something on it.
Gary, I do see one that's is asking if there's a reason why PM peak was used in the studies and not AM peak. And I think it's just worth noting that some of the studies did also include the AM peak. We summarized and shortened some of the information for today's webinar, but if you look in the recommendations report or the full reports that were published previously, there's a lot of extra information that's included in there that we just didn't include today for time's sake.
Yeah. There's a question here that was already answered about is DOT recommending the use of OTIS at this moment, and we're not dissuading people from it, but we're at a stage where there are a number of ways to calculate internal capture, and you know, OTIS definitely has some great advantages, but it does have some disadvantages that you got to pay every year, and it may not be the tool that is for you, especially if you're in a small local government that deals with mostly AM, PM, and daily trips of very few land uses. A simple spreadsheet might be your best bet. So just wanted to make that clear. We're not advertising for OTIS, though it is an excellent tool and one that seems to be getting better too.
Gary, I see a question from James Gugliotti. He asks, can the beach resort study be expanded to include inland resorts such as in the Orlando area? James, I think what you're referring to is the study conducted by District 4 on beaches and trip gen as a result of beaches, and I think that study was done completely independently of our study. We were not aware of it. Gary, are you able to expand a little bit more on that? I'm not sure how much knowledge you have on that study either. I think we just found out about it.
No, I have to beg complete ignorance on that. It looked like a lot of work had been done on it, and I had not put enough of my thought into it. But District 4, just here's a little plug for District 4, which is our Fort Lauderdale area office. they were the first ones to do trip internalization studies in the entire state. It wasn't us in central office that did it, and you know, at least since the 1970s, we have depended on District 4 to help lead the way. And so those of you that are from District 4, please don't depend on us to get everything for you. We really appreciate the work that you have done in your research, and the best thing to do is for us to carry it on.
I think the best contact in District 4 for that study would be John Wong. Put a personal plug out there for him.
Yeah. I got, here's a question from Michelle, and ITE gives guidance on when to use rates or equations, you know, based on the yeah. Okay, and I believe I answered that, and that's the numerical way that ITE makes that decision. But we also like to go the extra mile in taking a look at the actual site, and also to look at the scattergram of the land use you're looking at. You know, if it's a 3 million square foot site, go down to the 3 million square foot and look up. Do you see, you know, how many, which is in that you're not going to see many, how many X's you see in there. ITE does have a strictly mathematical way of making that decision, but also take a look at the kind of development you're looking at.
So John Crane followed up on our discussion of the beach study. He says that beach study was not conducted for the purposes of ITE and did not have the variables developed in a fashion that could be useful by ITE, but it was an intriguing first step.
Yeah. So John, that was one of the things when I looked at it. It was more useful for the large-scale regional travel projection models rather than ITE, and that was a question I had on that.
There, yeah, he says it was used to get a better handle on the models.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, John.
John, much appreciated.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Gary, as a follow-up to Michelle's question a moment ago that you answered about the ITE's guidance on when to use rates and equations, she had another question. Says, perhaps you mentioned this, but do these new Florida rates give R-squared, standard deviation, number of studies, etc.? And the answer is yes. Once again, for this presentation, we cut a lot of that information out, but if you look in the original studies that were published, I believe they're on FDOT's website, I think there's pages included that are very similar to how ITE lays out their trip generation information.
Okay, great. And just another warning here that R-squared is not the end of the argument. You know, you can have a really hard, a really high R-squared, and I'll give you the one example that I've known for a while. If somebody's building an office and they can tell you how many employees are going to be working there, that has the highest R-square. But there aren't that many developers who can tell you how many employees are going to be working in the building that they're constructing. So you got to keep in mind there are other factors than R-square.
Right, and Gary, just to follow up on that, when you mentioned the office example, it's also good to pay attention to how the graph is laid out with the equation line versus the average rate line, because I believe it's office where if you've got a small floor area and you're down on the left side of the graph, there's quite a difference between the two lines on there. So you'll get vastly different results depending on whether you use the rate or the equation. So you got to be careful in situations like that.
I mean, yeah, we can make all these little, and I know I'm talking amongst friends here. We can make all our little shortcuts, and not 1, 2, 3, but Excel spreadsheets, so we don't have to pay the outrageous prices ITE are charging. But in the end, it's really good to have all the data that's in the actual ITE trip generation, now that they call it the manual. And you may not need a bunch of copies of it, but if your office does this sort of work, you should have within a 20-minute or 30-minute drive a real copy of it that you can look at. So there's my plug for ITE, even though they're outrageously priced. I see some other questions. You already answered the one about the AM and PM, why we only concentrated on the PM, and that's because we thought we were simplifying things, and just actually added more questions.
Looks like we've answered, I think we've answered almost all of them.
Oh, man, this is an amazingly active audience. I really appreciate just how inquisitive and active this group has been, and we will get information to you on how to get almost everything we talked about in this short talk, and there is a question that has been answered, but I wanted to add to it. It was about the campus apartment with suites. There was so much differentiation between them. It was really hard to make a recommendation. And Holly and Martin, you can chime in here, but the amount of amenities that can be present or may not be present, the distance from the campus, whether it's a free shuttle service from the apartment, or whether there's a bus happening every 10 minutes from the local transit authority, all seem to have made gigantic amounts of difference in the rates. That is one that seemed to be a lot of inconsistencies. I mean, not inconsistencies, but a lot of variation in the rates.
That's quite true, Gary. If anyone's really interested in that, they should look at the report, because in our site selection, Holly did extensive research. We tried to determine percent occupied. We went out and looked at parking spaces occupied. We looked at a lot of different things trying to find some magic answers, and like I say, they were quite different.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Thank you for questions.
Yeah, and there was a question that I saw earlier. I think it was answered with typing in. I may have misspoken during the presentation, but just to clarify, the land use code 814 is not new. It used to be specialty retail in the 8th edition and previous versions. But I think what ITE did was they renumbered and shifted some things around, and now 814 is variety store. So variety store is completely new, but they moved specialty retail from 814 to now it's 826. So all the data in 814 is new and variety store is new, but the specialty retail that used to be 814 has now been switched to 826. And they weren't real clear on telling everyone that when they did it. So
matter of fact, I need to I need to who was that? I need to thank Bradley William on that because I really didn't know either. But since I'm the oldest person here, I have a copy of, oh goodness gracious, I have like the 3rd edition in my office that's in a 3-ring binder and all the other editions. So I said, oh my God, it is in there. Yeah. So where did we go wrong? So thank you for bringing that out. I think we will make that one of the slides. I would not have discovered it without you. Okay.
Well, I think we've answered all the questions.
And if not, you know how to get in touch with us. We will follow this up with an email, and
we'll send out the reports and a copy of this presentation for your review.
Okay.
Yeah, and Gary and Andrew, thanks again for having me on today, and thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. Hope you got something out of it, and again, just let us know if you have any questions or concerns on our report.
All right.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.